Okay. Hi, class. My name is Dr. Holly Hagel, and I'm going to be teaching mitigating differences with you for the next 8 weeks. As you saw from my introductory email, that we're having this hybrid class first, and I've created this voiceover MP4 file for you to review as part of the requirements of the hybrid class for this week. This is not going to be a perfect video. I am doing it on my laptop with my headset, so I hope that the quality is acceptable, uh, acceptable for you all, the sound quality and capability that you can make it through this week. But of course, I will post the PowerPoints themselves and be available for any questions week 2 when we meet face-to-face. Okay, so you know this is Mitigating Differences. We're meeting Mondays from 5:30 to 9:30, and we're meeting in 719 Academic Hall. I have posted and emailed you the syllabus, so hopefully you've already reviewed it, but I wanted to highlight a few things. The textbooks, actually for this seminar, are 2 of them, Working Through Conflict and Appreciative Inquiry. And I'll show you what the covers look like, but hopefully you've acquired the textbooks already online or through the bookstore. Any supplemental readings that I assign or activities, I will usually scan whatever chapter or article, post the article in a PDF file for you guys to review. So there's no other requirements except for these 2 books. So just a quick overview of all of the components of the course, the assignments. We will have a group project, and it is a conflict resolution case study worth 30%. There'll be a 3-part conflict resolution project, and this project all happens on Blackboard, and that is worth 30% total, or 10% per section. We will do what, I actually just changed this assignment, so I'll have to change this. And it was called a journal reflection, but I don't think that was a good reflection of the actual assignment, so we're just calling it, let's see, a 6 performance domains reflection assignment. So I'll make that change in that chart. And these refer to the 6 performance domains that are really the cornerstone of your degree. And so this assignment is worth 20 points. And I'll have to change it in this chart. I'll make that revision up here for you guys in this chart. It's essentially a reflection assignment, though, meant for you to reflect on the performance domains in relation to conflict resolution and being a leader, managing conflict. And then I do attribute 20% to attendance and class participation. So each student is entitled to miss 1 class, no problem, but after that, there's a very minor deduction for any classes you might have to make or miss. Okay, so the group project, this is basically an overview. We'll go over this more in week 2 when we're face-to-face. But it's really a case study that you create. If you had a chance to look at the Fogler book, if you got it already, you'll see they have a bunch of case studies in the text. It's meant to be a similar case study driven way for you to apply some of the concepts we'll learn about managing conflict, different results or outcomes of conflict, managing conflict through a destructive cycle, managing conflict to make it more productive. So these are the basic components of it. You'll have to provide a brief summary of the case, which you have to create or de-identify if it's a real organization, the members of the organization, the summary of what is the conflict within the organization, run an analysis of the conflict through destructive and productive cycles, have an illustrative map or chart or some sort of visual that describes the relationships between parties, their needs and interests, and then have some sort of outcome or potential outcome of the conflict. What are their gains and losses? What was the level of satisfaction of all parties? What kind of justice was distributed through the conflict resolution. Was it distributive justice or procedural justice? And this would all be composed into a paper that's about the length of 10 to 15 pages, double-spaced. It's one group project, so each group will be required to present your overview of your project in class on November 21st. And there's also a peer review part of the rubric, which I'll share with you guys in class on our second week, October 24th. I'll share the rubric for this. So you'll all be graded the same on the paper, but the difference in grades could come in your peer review. And it's very easy to complete the peer review and you'll earn the points for the peer review. So this is an overview of the group project. And the second major assignment is this 3-part conflict resolution project. It's entirely on course Blackboard. And so part 1, you'll describe an experience of conflict with a minimum of 200 words. Usually people easily meet that, especially when they think about a conflict they may have been involved in. Of course, you have to de-identify any real names or locations. It should be a fictitious conflict or one that you have experienced and de-identified the information of the participants. So you just have to explain a conflict that you've been part of. Part 2, and post that on Blackboard. And then part 2, you will receive peer feedback from 3 of your students. So you are to provide feedback to 3 other student posts, a minimum of 100 words, giving them constructive feedback on their conflict and or highlighting resources that might help them resolve their conflict. And then part 3 of the assignment is to develop a conflict resolution strategy involving the middle path, which is a specific construct in the Fogler textbook, so that you move towards integration. And that response must be a minimum of 100 words. And that's the 3rd part. And all of this is posted in Blackboard. And then the 6th performance domain reflection assignment. We'll get into this more, but the entire assignment should have 4 entries. The first entry should look at how authenticity and vision are used to manage conflict, and how would you demonstrate authenticity and visioning as a leader in managing conflict. The second entry looks at cultural relation and quality capacity as it relates to conflict. The third entry looks at service systems and communication. And then the 4th entry is an overview of your theory of how you're applying conflict resolution as a leader. So this assignment is meant to tie in your 6 performance domains, and some students in the past have used it as their learner outcomes. So that's what some of this text is under each of the 6 domains in blue font. It highlights how you might use that as a learner outcome, this assignment as part of your learner outcomes. It's entirely up to you if you think that's relevant. For the purposes of this assignment, you just have to have these entries in relation to the 6 performance domains and conflict resolution. But if you could make that into a learner outcome, I'd be more than happy to sign off on that. Again, we can discuss this more in class, and also I'll have examples that I'll post online of student work that I have their permission to post an exemplar assignment so that you can see what they look like. Okay, so we're in week 1. This is a hybrid class, so I hope you didn't go to the class because we're not meeting face-to-face. Reviewing this video and the PowerPoints I'm going to go over as part of the assignment. You should, of course, read the introduction and chapter 1 to understand the content, because I am only summarizing the content of the text. I'm going to post a link to Dr. Joseph Fogler's website and a video that I'd like you to review of his work. And then there'll be an online discussion board in which you're required to respond to this prompt about Dr. Joseph Fogler's work and given a reflection on his work as well as a reflection on the idea of stonewalling. So we've got 2 assignments for this week. Week 2 through 7, we're in class every week. It's pretty self-explanatory. We're going to review these chapters. I will give you time to work on your group projects, and I will show you, I will post an example project. I will post the rubrics on Blackboard so you can review them, and we can review them together. And then I always give you time in class to start working on your group project. The third week, we again will be in the Folger textbook, examining the architecture of conflict. You'll have time for your group project, and or if your part 1 is due that week, so posting your assignment is something that is important so that other people, because the part 2 is peer review comment on part 1, so it's very important that the part 1 of the assignment is done in a timely fashion so that you guys can respond to each other, since you do have a requirement to respond to at least 3 of your peers. Week 4, we'll do the examining Chapter 8 of Folger. You'll have group project time. I would like a check-in from each group to make sure you're on pace to do your group project in a timely fashion, and also look at more carefully at the 6 performance domain assignment. Week 5 and the week 4 will be the halfway point as well. Week 5, you can see that we're switched to the appreciative inquiry model, and we'll be looking at chapters 1 and 2. We will also be completing part 3 of the conflict resolution by the beginning of class. So that has to be done online again. And since you're responding to each other, it's important that people post, and that way others have opportunity to respond to but by the time we're to part 3, there should be plenty of posts. This is the part 1 posting that is essential that people get that up on time so others can give feedback. Then week 6 is devoted entirely to group project presentations, and if there is time at the end of the project presentations in class, you can use that to work on your 6 performance domains assignment, but all groups must present. You only hand in 1 paper, and your presentation is an overview of your paper, an overview of the case that you present into the entire class. And then the paper you hand in to me, just 1 per group, and you guys can decide how you want to present. It can be entirely up to you. You could chunk it up. You can just assign 2 people to present on behalf of your group, or you can decide that everybody in the group will present a small piece. That's week 6. Week 7, we're still we'll be actually finishing up appreciative inquiry with chapter 3, and you can have some more time to work on the 6 performance domains if we get done early. And then week 8 is hybrid. We're not meeting face-to-face. That's when your 6 performance domain assignment is due, and there'll be an assignment for you to upload it into Blackboard. It should be uploaded in the form of a presentation, much like the one I'm about to show you. It should be a voiceover PowerPoint that is an overview of each of your entries. And then you'll post it online, and I will view it and grade it. So that's what that means by individual student overviews of journal entry presentations. In addition, you'll have 1 discussion board appreciative inquiry assignment that will have to be posted in order to make, this is to facilitate having class time as a hybrid. So there'll be 2 assignments due that week. The 6 performance domains assignment, which I expect to be a voiceover PowerPoint, and then the appreciative inquiry assignment, which will be in Blackboard. And I should explain that if I say CourseWeb, that's because I teach at Pitt, and they call it CourseWeb, and at Point Park, you guys call it Blackboard, so sometimes I get it confused, the terminology, so please forgive me. It's actually the same system. They're both Blackboard shells, so that's what I'm referring to. Okay, so I think that's enough about the syllabus. The rest of the syllabus is the standard university policies, and of course at the top of the syllabus is my information, my Point Park email, office hours by appointment. I usually get to class early. You can meet me there if you need to do one-on-one, or we can set up some other time that's mutually convenient to us. Okay, so let me go to Folger. Just in case you haven't seen it, but this is what the textbook looks like, the cover, 2012. And this is the second textbook, Appreciative Inquiry. So you don't get confused, maybe order a different edition. And so really, I've taught this course several times now, and I really do enjoy examining the idea of conflict and working through a conflict resolution model, because Folger has a model. And he identifies strategies for relationships, groups, and organizations. So we do look at conflict at a personal level just a little bit, but more closely as it relates to groups and organizations, because of course this is a leadership class and you are focusing on leadership qualities and managing conflict. So I cover the introduction of the text because I think it's actually key into understanding Folger's model. He studies conflict as a synthesis of social science, research, and theory. So he looks at psychology, sociology, organizational psychology, and communications. And he draws from these fields, and he discusses and shows the research models that exist in these fields. So it's actually a pretty comprehensive review of conflict. And Folger points out that conflict can have positive and negative outcomes. There are net positive outcomes to conflict. That's not always negative. But we have to, especially as leaders and managers, understand that we have to navigate the negative outcomes and try to mitigate more positive outcomes. And he gives us a model to do that called the middle path. We'll review that later. But when you think of negative outcomes of a conflict, you often think of there's tension, it's heated, people get angry perhaps, and it could potentially lead to more conflict. But on the other side of conflict, sometimes conflict releases energy. It releases built-up tension. It leads to creative solutions and ideas. And sometimes at the end of conflict that has, especially particularly conflict that has been navigated well, you can ultimately strengthen relationships. These are only a few. There's more negative and positive outcomes of conflict. But a lot of the difficulty we have with conflict generates from the idea that conflict causes uncertainty. Uncertainty causes tension, especially in groups and organizations. So that is one thing we have to particularly be cognizant of as leaders. The other thing is that positive and negative sides of a conflict can be managed. You have to, as a manager and leader, believe you can navigate the negative sides of conflict and not just ignore them. And a resolution to a conflict is a solution that all parties accept. And that might be compromise. It might be that people actually come out losing something, but they accept this resolution because they're seeking a resolution. And I think you'll see that more when you look at the Folger video, and he talks about the idea of the orange, the ugly orange. And we can talk about that in class. So here's a definition. Conflict. The key to working through conflict is not to minimize the differences, but rather to accept both the positive and negative effects. So think about it. There's positive and negative outcomes to conflict. So Folger's position is that we look at conflict as an interaction system. A system has productive and destructive interactions, and they can have cycles which we move in positive or negative directions. So if you look at it more as a system, then a system can be managed. And in particular, you are leaders already in your existing careers, or you aspire to be more of a leader within your existing profession. And so this is a key piece of management and leadership that you're always going to have to address. So here's a definition of conflict. And I would like to highlight, this is something that you could use in your paper, right? You can kind of craft your group case around this definition. and it's on page 4 of the Fogler text in the introduction. The interaction of interdependent people who perceive incompatibility and the possibility of interference from others as a result of this incompatibility. So let's pause for a moment and look at a couple of the words that are key in this definition of conflict. The interaction of interdependent people. So you have to have some sort of group dynamics. You have to rely on each other for something. Interdependence. And then there's this concept of perceived incompatibility. Perhaps as you navigate the conflict, you can see that it's not as incompatible as perhaps both parties or one or two parties thought was incompatible. So keep this definition in mind, and we will circle back to it in the subsequent chapters. Still in the introduction of the text, Fogler talks about 4 arenas or settings of conflict. Again, and this is actually in the title of the introduction. There's interpersonal relationships that can have conflicts. I think we've all experienced that. It's hard not to as humans, especially adults. There's conflict between groups or teams, conflict within organizations, or conflict in intergroup settings or individuals that make up a specific social group. These are the major 4 arenas or settings that conflict occurs in. And these arenas differ by type and their levels of interdependence. Interdependence of the parties relies on the power in the setting, and we'll examine power dynamics in particular as it relates to conflict. And here's the idea, again, as I mentioned to you a couple slides ago, to keep in mind that Fogler's definition of conflict is the interaction of interdependent people. So this idea that of the levels of engagement between parties is a key feature across whatever settings a conflict is playing out. So how much level of interaction do you actually have with parties in a conflict? Continuing on, still in the introduction of the book, we look at the idea of productive and destructive conflict interactions. So productive interactions, the parties believe they can attain important goals, and it depends on a certain amount of flexibility. So maybe you accept certain things because you're interdependent and you mutually have to achieve a goal together. So you might compromise or demonstrate flexibility. And in destructive conflict interaction, parties could either avoid interaction completely or outright display hostility, intention, or the opposite of flexibility, inflexibility. So this idea that there's productive and destructive interactions in conflict is something that you should be A, looking at when you're a leader, and B, trying to manage. So trying to look to navigate a destructive interaction and make it a productive interaction. Maybe by having a mutual goal, establishing a mutual goal between groups so that they have to depend on each other and demonstrate flexibility. Again, something we can discuss further as we go through the chapters and also, as we meet each other face to face. So Fogler I've said this already a couple times, but conflict exhibits both productive and destructive interactions. And the goal of the entire model and strategy of Fogler is to demonstrate how conflict can be managed to sustain positive conflict interaction patterns. So you can shift it from a destructive cycle or interaction to a more positive interaction. And that's the thing we want to highlight within Fogler, but also as managers and leaders. Within a conflict, and then if you have the syllabus open as I was going through these PowerPoints, you might see some of the things that I've already are highlighted in the group project, but there's always some sort of outcome as a result of conflict. And sometimes these can be measured in terms of gains and losses, like money, hours, maybe you won a client, increase in tests where they're somewhat measurable. Or there could be a value that's on some sort of arbitrary scale that's important to the parties in the conflict. But there are other outcomes to conflict, like levels of satisfaction, and also the idea of fairness or social justice. So depending on the setting or the arena of the conflict and the outcomes, you could measure it in different ways. Here's a suggestion of 3: the idea of gains and losses, level of satisfaction, and in terms of fairness or social justice. So when we think about fairness or social justice, we're talking about terms that the allocation of resources among participants or recipients of within a situation. So maybe a group has been more disadvantaged, and in order to establish fairness, resources have to be reallocated. That could be a potential outcome when looking at fairness or social justice. Another potential outcome for conflict is procedural justice. The process in which the conflict is resolved might be important. And so here we think in terms of maybe parties are mitigated by the justice system, going to court. Think about Judge Judy, maybe. Think about any legal situation which you have a setting as a procedural justice where you can state your case and you might be on the losing end of the case. However, the conflict is resolved even if you're on the losing end because you agreed to that system of procedural justice, you allow the process to play itself out, and a decision is made to resolve that conflict. Okay, so all that was just an introduction of Folger. Now I'm going to summarize Chapter 1. I'm looking through my notes. There's about 15 slides that we need to go through. Again, this is a summary of a chapter. It does not take the place of reviewing and reading the chapters. So this Chapter 1 focuses on communication and conflict. And Folger talks in terms of a model of effective conflict management as having 2 broad phases. And this is where he's starting to pull together his model of the middle path. So the first phase is this differentiation phase, and then it's followed by the integration phase. Again, these are things you may have seen in the syllabus in the group project. So you want to talk about a group and how they facilitate or navigate their way through a conflict. What is in the differentiation phase, and then what would be comprised in the integration phase. So let's look at this a little more closely. In the differentiation phase, parties raise the conflict issues. They bring up what's bothering them, and you spend a significant amount of time and energy clarifying your positions, pursuing the reasons behind those positions, and acknowledging differences. So this is a very large chunk of time when you're thinking about conflict and managing conflict. In In the phase, that follows the differentiation phase, and you could have other cycles within differentiation, like escalation of negative outcomes, or you can have maybe compromise and more positive outcomes. But after the differentiation phase, the integration phase begins, in which parties acknowledge common ground. And then they start looking for solutions. They explore options and move towards some solution or resolution. And the solution is what meets everyone's needs, or one everyone can live with, all parties can live with. And sometimes that means somebody gives up ground, or they give up and leverage resources, but a solution presents itself to resolve the conflict. So here's a little bit more about the differentiation phase. In the differentiation phase, you examine the conflict issues. You clarify positions. Maybe you look at the causes of what might comprise negative emotions. You have to allow for adequate differentiation for a group in order for a resolution to emerge. And in the differentiation phase, it could lead to some open confrontation or competition. competition is typically a part of this differentiation phase, depending on the group and the setting that it's occurring. Let's talk about the differentiation phase a little bit more. So within the differentiation phase, you have opposing positions that need to be articulated because you have to understand what each party is feeling or experiencing or their grievances. So you have to articulate or create as the leader the vehicle for groups to articulate their position. And these positions need to be clarified so that you can either examine what areas of compatibility or areas of incompatibility can be determined. And it's a necessary phase in order for a constructive conflict resolution to emerge. You have to allow, you cannot skip differentiation phase if you're trying to manage conflict, according to Fogler. So in differentiation phase, you can expect some negative things to possibly happen, in which case you have to manage, like escalation. And these can add to a destructive tendency, and they, in effect, can also escalate to the point where they spiral out of control, like what you would think of when you think of typically serial arguing, where people are just repeating their position over and over, and they're not getting beyond that position to a resolution of some sort. They just keep repeating their grievances or their feelings of being marginalized or left out. So escalation. Also in the differentiation phase, you could expect some people or some groups to avoid it. Just avoid conflict. They never want to find common ground. They don't want to clarify positions. They just want to avoid it completely and sort of maybe work in parallel or work independent. So that's something that could happen during differentiation. And then we have rigidity. The idea that people are just going to stay the course and the parties fail to go through differentiation. They stick to their ground and they're not willing to search for acceptable solutions, and rigidity. So here is possible responses to the demands of differentiation in conflict solutions. This is Fogler's model. You have the differentiation phase in the middle, which leads to integration and then problem solving, right? However, as you see the offshoots, you have inflexibility, which could happen during differentiation, and that could lead to some spiraling escalation, or you have some inflexibility that can completely lead to avoidance or rigidity. So you can see how during the differentiation phase, you can get off course and a conflict solution may not ever be achieved. So here's the idea of the middle path, moving towards integration. How can you move conflict from this differentiation in which spiraling and escalation could occur, or avoidance and rigidity can occur? How can you move it to this integration path, into this more towards integration and into problem solving, as in particular as leaders and managers? So Fogler suggests taking the middle path. And he looks at, in this chapter, some of the benefits of differentiation, some motivations for why you'd want to work on conflict, and how you can make a clean transition into integration. So first, he talks about recognizing destructive cycles within a group. And you can see in your text, page 22, table 1.1, some of the symptoms of destructive cycles that we should be aware of if we're managing and helping to manage teams through conflict or groups through conflict. There's this idea that you could use third parties to help intervene, a neutral party, a negotiator, or you could take countermeasures that can be taken to avoid destructive cycles. Then Fogler continues on into this idea of 4 properties of a conflict interaction. So this idea that conflict is constituted and sustained by moves and counter moves during an interaction. So parties make moves and counter moves, and even avoidance is a move. He talks about patterns of behavior and conflicts that perpetuate themselves. He also talks about the influence in terms of relationships and how they influence conflict interactions. And the idea that conflict interaction is also heavily influenced by the setting in which it occurs, or the context. So again, when thinking about your group project, think about these 4 properties that Folger outlines in this chapter 1 about communications and conflicts, and see if you can run your case study through these 4 properties. You know, what moves and counter moves did different parties do within their conflict? You know, what patterns of behaviors emerged? How were these patterns influenced? And what were the effects of the relationship? For instance, was the relationship one of hierarchy? Was there somebody who had authority over other groups, or were they mutual, peers, or parallel workers? So things to consider for the group project. So let's look at each of these 4 properties a little more closely. And then that rounds out chapter 1. So these 4 properties: conflict situated and sustained by moves and counter moves. So we all have actions and reactions, and we want to look at the behavioral sequence of these responses, these moves and counter moves. So for an example, I encourage you to look at page 25 of your textbook, where Folger outlines moves and responses, moves and counter moves. For property 2, patterns of behavior and conflicts tend to perpetuate themselves. This is the idea that sometimes a conflict can take on a life of its own. And this is an idea that it moves more towards escalation or avoidance and not productive resolution. So a string of actions, you know, like we have these expectations, and it leads to miscalculating people's behaviors within a conflict. So a pattern that's sort of like you anticipate a certain outcome even before it happens, and it's actually miscalculation that leads to a spiral of the behaviors within a conflict. Property 3, that conflict interaction is influenced by and in turn which affects relationships. So perhaps parties agree to and clarify their positions in a conflict, but and you come up with a solution. Maybe there's gains and losses. Maybe it was through distributive justice or just allocating resources or time, and people agree to that solution. However, the relationship is affected by the resolution. So it's acknowledging that it's not just the interactions, it's not just the gains and losses, but it's also how it affects relationships between members of groups or organizations. So how the present and future relationship might be affected by the conflict is considered. Also, this concept of attitudes and assumptions about relationships, how verbal and nonverbal communication affect conflict, and the concept that many people, especially in organizations when they experience conflict, are just trying to save face, and so that prompts avoidance because they don't actually want to deal with the conflict because it might show a vulnerability or a weakness. And then the 4th property of a conflict interaction is influenced by the context or the setting in which it occurs. So when you think about the setting, you also have to think about the people's personal histories with conflict. So perhaps people have had experiences with conflict in which they were always on the losing side, net losses versus gains, or it was never resolved into integration, so it only went into, you know, avoidance or escalation. And so people's personal histories with conflict affect how conflict interaction plays out because people have these anticipatory expectations. The climate or atmosphere surrounding the situation or the conflict has to be considered. Previous experiences with the relationship in general. And then, of course, personality traits of the members of the group who are experiencing the conflict. So that is Chapter 1 of Fogler. That's an overview, a summary. It does not replace reading the chapter. You should read along in the chapter to get an idea. You're going to next go to the discussion board to look at Dr. Fogler's website and an interview with him. And then we're going to do an activity in the discussion board on stonewalling. And it's simply something you're going to have to reply to a discussion board post about this concept of stonewalling and your thoughts on that. And then that's it for this week. Week 1 will be done. All right, thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you in class and meeting you face to face.